The Pacific burned with relentless fury as summer 1945 drew to a close. Tokyo smoldered in ruins, reduced to ash by American firebombing raids. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained intact, but only because President Truman had not yet authorized the atomic bombs now waiting in silence. Japan, bloodied and cornered, refused to surrender. Their high command clung to hope that the Americans, weary of island hopping and soaked in their own losses, might accept a conditional peace. But the United States, driven by the specter of Pearl Harbor and the political will of an emboldened military, had begun final preparations for Operation Downfall, an invasion that would dwarf Normandy and alter the world's course. In Washington, maps were unrolled across long tables in dimly lit war rooms. General George C. Marshall stood with a quiet firmness, his voice flat and without exaggeration, as he detailed what lay ahead. Operation Downfall would unfold in two stages. First, in November, Operation Olympic would strike the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. Then, if the enemy still refused to yield, Operation Coronet would follow in the spring, landing a massive force on the Kanto Plain, just south of Tokyo. It was a plan built not on speed, but on overwhelming force. Millions of troops, thousands of ships, and air support so vast it would blot out the sun. President Truman listened, leaning forward in his chair, a frown etched permanently across his brow. His recent decision not to authorize the immediate use of atomic weapons had created division among his advisors. Some, like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, believed Japan would never surrender unless faced with unimaginable destruction. Others, especially in the Navy, feared a drawn-out land invasion would bleed the United States dry. Yet Truman, cautious by nature, had chosen to wait. Intelligence reports hinted that Emperor Hirohito might yet be swayed by diplomacy. Still, the war could not pause. The invasion would proceed unless peace was formally accepted, unconditional and absolute. Across the Pacific, thousands of miles away, the men who would carry the burden of this plan prepared in silence. Private Daniel Harper of the 25th Infantry Division crouched beneath a canvas tent in Guam, writing a letter he wasn't sure would ever be delivered. He had survived late, barely, and had seen friends buried in shallow jungle graves. The thought of landing on the shores of Japan filled him with dread, but he pushed it aside with the mechanical detachment of a soldier. Orders were orders. He would follow them, just as he always had. In Tokyo, General Korachika Anami, Minister of War, stood before the Supreme War Council, his voice unshaken. He insisted that surrender would dishonor the emperor and obliterate the soul of the nation. Around him, military officers nodded grimly. They had committed to Ketsugo, Operation Decisive, where every man, woman, and child would resist the invader. Young schoolgirls trained with bamboo spears. Pilots readied themselves for kamikaze missions. Entire villages dug pits and stockpiled explosives. Japan, though beaten, was not broken. At the heart of this grim calculation sat Emperor Hirohito, isolated yet omnipresent. His silence carried the weight of millions. He was both figurehead and god to his people, yet his own belief in Japan's destiny had begun to waver. Advisors whispered of peace, of preserving the imperial line even in defeat. But the militarists still held sway, and each day he delayed brought the Americans closer to his shores. In private, he walked the stone gardens of the imperial palace, eyes distant, his country's fate entwined with his own silence. The ocean swelled with steel. Allied ships gathered in Mariana harbors, decks loaded with tanks, artillery, and men. Aircraft buzzed constantly overhead, rehearsing the unrelenting air campaign that would precede the landings. Hospitals expanded, grave sites were pre-marked, and blood supplies were rationed with brutal foresight. The American public, shielded from the full magnitude of the coming invasion, heard only filtered updates through newspapers and radio. Few understood that Operation Downfall would eclipse every battle the war had seen: Okinawa, Normandy, even Stalingrad. And yet, uncertainty hung like fog over every decision. Could Japan's defenses hold? Would the Soviet Union seize the opportunity to invade from the north, cutting into Japan as they had into Eastern Europe? Would the atomic bombs remain unused, a silent threat, or would their existence alter the moral calculus of war forever? As the days dwindled and ships began to set sail, the final preparations moved forward with machine-like precision. The plan was massive, its scope unfathomable, and the cost impossible to predict. In every soldier's kit bag was a copy of the same government-issued pamphlet, Instructions for Occupation Duty in Japan. Yet many of those soldiers wondered silently if they'd live to see the occupation, or if the black sands of Kyushu would become their final resting place. The world stood at the brink. One path led to surrender, conditional, uncertain, perhaps dishonorable in the eyes of some. The other led to blood. Cities would burn, families would be torn apart, and the outcome, even in victory, might redefine the very idea of what it meant to win a war. As the final message crackled across the Pacific wires, "Downfall is green," the fate of millions was set in motion, and with it, a chapter of history began that had once existed only in contingency plans and whispered fears. Now, it would become real. Rain lashed against the steel hull of the USS Missouri as it edged closer to the coast of Kyushu. It was November 1st, 1945, D-Day for Operation Olympic, and the dawn broke with a gray, reluctant light over the waters of the East China Sea. Allied ships, thousands of them, filled the horizon in every direction. To the Americans, it looked like the invasion of Normandy all over again, but amplified, swollen with scale and dread. For the Japanese, it was the arrival of the apocalypse. Private Daniel Harper sat huddled below deck, clutching his rifle like a talisman. Around him, men silently adjusted gear and checked ammunition. There was no banter this morning, no false bravado, only the knowledge that ahead of them waited the most fortified beaches any army had ever attempted to breach. The Japanese were not defending an island. They were defending their homeland, their families, their emperor. There would be no retreat. On land, General Mitsuru Ushijima stood on a ridge overlooking Kagoshima Bay. He had studied the Americans carefully, learned their patterns in Okinawa, and now he waited for them with patience carved from stone. The beaches were mined. Caves lined the hills behind them. Suicide boats hidden beneath tarps were ready to strike. What the Americans didn't yet understand, he believed, was that victory here was not measured in territory. It was measured in blood. If the invaders could be bled enough, perhaps their political resolve would break before Japan's will did. The first wave hit the beaches at dawn. Smoke, sand, and screams swallowed the air. Daniel leapt into the surf, bullets hissing like hornets around him. Men dropped beside him, some silent, others thrashing, their blood turning the waves red. But the line moved forward, crawling, clawing, yard by yard into a firestorm that never let up. Bunkers hidden beneath thick vegetation spewed machine gun fire. Mortars fell from hills that looked empty until they weren't. It was chaos, but it was orchestrated, and every foot of ground won cost a dozen lives. By nightfall, a narrow perimeter had been secured, but at a terrible price. Casualty numbers poured in by the hour, and already commanders whispered of miscalculation. The Japanese resistance was fiercer than anyone had predicted, and nowhere were they more dangerous than from the skies. Kamikaze pilots, young and desperate, threw themselves at Allied ships in waves, screaming the names of their families and the Emperor as they fell from the clouds like fire. Dozens of destroyers and troop transports were lost. The seas, once a symbol of Allied dominance, became graveyards of twisted steel and oil. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding from the flagship, clenched his jaw as reports came in. The landing was holding, barely. Reinforcements were on the way, but if this was a taste of what Operation Coronet would look like in the spring, it was enough to chill even the most seasoned strategists. He stared at the maps laid out before him, eyes scanning toward Honshu, where Tokyo sat like a fortress behind walls of mountains and bunkers. If Kyushu took months, what would the Kanto Plain cost? Meanwhile, deep within the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito remained locked in silence. Messages reached him hourly, each one more harrowing than the last. Cities on Kyushu were burning. Entire regiments had been annihilated. And yet the war cabinet, fractured and desperate, could not reach consensus. General Anami argued fiercely for continued resistance, even as the civilian toll mounted. His vision of honorable death refused to waver, even as reality crumbled around him. In the countryside, peasants took up arms, farmers turned into fighters, school children drilled by elderly veterans. Bamboo spears and Molotov cocktails were distributed by the thousands. Propaganda declared that 100 million would die before surrender. And increasingly, it looked like they might. In some villages, American paratroopers were ambushed by mobs wielding crude weapons. In others, whole families detonated grenades rather than face capture. The line between soldier and civilian blurred until it vanished entirely. The Soviet Union, watching from across the Sea of Japan, saw opportunity. In mid-November, Red Army troops surged down from Sakhalin into Hokkaido. Stalin, ever hungry, claimed the North under the banner of liberation, his eyes on post-war leverage. American diplomats scrambled to respond, but the focus remained fixed on the inferno-consuming Kyushu. The idea of a divided Japan, once unthinkable, now loomed with growing inevitability. As the weeks wore on, Daniel found himself in the ruins of Kagoshima, now barely a city. The fighting had moved inland, house to house, tunnel to tunnel. Every day felt like a lifetime. Sleep came only in fits, and even then, haunted by the images of fallen comrades and the wails of civilians caught in crossfire. He had stopped counting the days, the bodies, the distance from the shore. All that mattered was survival. Then, one morning, a lull. No mortars, no snipers, just the quiet rustling of wind through shattered windows. He and his unit advanced cautiously through the empty streets, weapons raised. They found nothing, only ash, silence, and eyes watching from darkened doorways. The city had been taken, but at what cost? A radio crackled. Orders came in. Prepare to regroup. The push toward Honshu would soon begin. Daniel didn't react. He just sat on the broken steps of a shrine, his face blank. The battle for Kyushu had ended. But the war, the real war, was only just beginning. Snow fell on the Kanto Plain, covering the fields in a deceptive hush. Tokyo loomed beyond the horizon, its skyline fractured but still defiant. It was March 1st, 1946, the day Operation Coronet began. Allied forces, reinforced by months of bloody experience on Kyushu, were now tasked with the final assault, the capture of Japan's political and spiritual heart. For the soldiers who had survived Olympic, this was not a new war, but a continuation of the same unrelenting nightmare. Private Daniel Harper, now a battle-worn sergeant, disembarked near Kujukuri Beach, northeast of Tokyo. The terrain was flat, exposed, and treacherously open to fire. The Japanese had fortified every possible approach, embedding machine guns into rice terraces, mines into every path, and artillery deep within mountain bunkers. As the boots of the first wave sank into freezing mud, the earth itself seemed to rebel, erupting with explosions that shattered bone and will. The Japanese defenders were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were conscripted students, elderly men with trembling hands, and teenage girls who had spent months preparing for this day. They fought with a fanaticism unmatched even on Kyushu. Suicide squads ambushed convoys. Traps hidden beneath floorboards turned entire buildings into tombs. Civilians drilled into seeing surrender as dishonor turned kitchen knives into weapons. The line between battlefield and neighborhood dissolved completely. Despite it all, the Allied advance was methodical. Generals Hodge and Eichelberger coordinated a pincer movement that steadily closed around Tokyo from east and south. But for every mile gained, hundreds died. American morale wavered, not from cowardice, but from the exhaustion of fighting a war that refused to end. Medics reported rising cases of psychological trauma. Whole units moved like shadows, their silence a defense against the chaos that waited behind every door. In Washington, President Truman faced pressure unlike anything since the war began. Reports from the front were grim. Casualties soared past 500,000. Public support, once unshakable, began to fracture. The debate over the atomic bomb reignited with fury. Some argued it should have been used before a single soldier set foot on Japanese soil. Others feared its unleashing now, amidst civilian population centers, would mark the beginning of a new, uncontrollable age. But in Tokyo, the Japanese government was unraveling. General Anami, increasingly isolated, insisted on fighting to the last man. His eyes, once proud, now burned with desperation. But others, Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, saw the inevitability of defeat. The emperor, silent for so long, began to speak behind closed doors, questioning the purpose of continued resistance. Cities burned. Children starved. The sacredness of the nation was being consumed from within. And then came the spark. On April 12, 1946, a detonation thundered over Osaka. The United States, with Operation Coronet at a deadlock and mounting fears of Soviet encroachment from the north, deployed its first atomic bomb on the Japanese mainland. The mushroom cloud rose into the spring sky, blotting out all argument. An estimated 100,000 perished instantly. Within hours, Hirohito summoned his closest advisors. No longer could divine legacy or national pride justify the annihilation of his people. Surrender, once unspoken, became necessary. Daniel Harper heard the news the next morning. He was crouched in the ruins of Chiba, his unit preparing for another push, when the word came down. Ceasefire orders would follow. There was no celebration, no cheering, only a hollow silence, as if their ears could not trust what they'd heard. Some wept. Others sat still, stunned. Daniel stared at the clouds, blinking through smoke and ash, unable to feel anything at all. On May 3, 1946, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio, as he had once before. His voice, serene but somber, announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. Weeks later, Daniel walked through what remained of Tokyo. Rubble stretched in every direction, temples crumbled beside office blocks, and silence reigned where once millions bustled. In the heart of the city, Allied flags fluttered atop government buildings. Military police coordinated relief efforts, and everywhere were civilians, haunted, hollow-eyed, survivors of a siege so devastating that the term victory no longer felt appropriate. He passed a group of children, their clothes patched and faces thin. One of them looked up at him and smiled faintly. Daniel returned the gesture, though it felt foreign to him now. The war had stripped away layers he would never recover. He thought of home, of the friends he'd buried, of the faces he'd never forget. But beneath the fatigue, there was a sliver of something else. Peace, yes, but also a question that refused to fade. Was it worth it? The invasion had avoided a prolonged war, some would say. It had ended the conflict on American terms. Yet the cost, millions of dead, a shattered nation, and the unleashing of atomic power, would echo for generations. In classrooms and courtrooms, historians would debate what could have been done differently. But for Daniel and the millions who had lived it, the war was not a theory. It was memory carved in flesh and fire. As he boarded the transport ship weeks later, bound for a homeland he no longer fully recognized, Daniel turned once more to look at the skyline of Tokyo. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across a city that had refused to surrender until it had no choice. The war had ended, but the story of its cost was only beginning.